So are you using the 3 most effective tactics during your interviewing and interrogation? Let's check tip number 38 and find out. Hey, Stan Walters, welcome back to 101 Tips for Interviewers and Interrogators. This is tip number 38. And this time about interviewing and interrogation, we're talking about the 3 most effective tactics that you should be using during your interviews and interrogations. It's pretty difficult to try to pin down exactly what techniques are working and what are the most effective. And you hear a lot of bragging about this one's best, that one's best, use mine, use that. But let's step back and look a little bit more at the philosophy, and let's look at empirical evidence that supports the tactics that you should be using. Now, studies of interview and interrogation are actually, there's a lot more of them being conducted today, particularly since the approach and the advent and beginning of the Innocence Project, and looking specifically at what interviewers are using. Same thing happened back in late 1980s, or 1979, 1980, when England was looking at its police and criminal evidence in 1984. And looking at the tactics that interviewers first were being taught, and then the application of those tactics in the interview room, and what were ones that were causing problems. Now, so we can always tell, don't do this, don't do that, don't try this, and so forth, which leaves you saying, well, then what in the hell do I use? What is working? So the studies that are pointed in that direction right now, trying to find what are the most effective tactics and ones that are best for you to deploy. Now, one study's been replicated, and there's pieces of it that have been redone again. And I believe the original researcher was a group of Dr. Richard Leo and some of his researchers. So they took 600 videotaped interviews. So you got a really great body of evidence here. What's interesting, they took it from 3 different jurisdictions. So that the concept here is that we'd spread the study around, so we're not seeing just one agency who's trained one way. But we're looking across multiple agencies and hundreds of interviews for each one. The concept was then, let's look at the end after the interview is done. Does it get the critical information that's needed to close the case? Is it supported by empirical evidence, lab evidence, or 2 unimpeached witnesses? So is it getting genuine, valuable information that's able to close the case? Now, what they did is each of these 600 interviews, they looked at every single one individually and what specific tactics was the guy using. And there was some 12, 13, 14 of these. For example, was the interview using an accusatory or confrontational style type of tactic, which is characterized by a guilt assumptive approach? Is it a more narrative-based or information-gathering process? Okay. Did you look at the things, did the interviewer sit close to the subject? I've heard a lot of times you sit really close and you put your knee in and split the body and so forth. And do what one guy calls, you do attacking those, as he calls it, kinetic judo. Another story about that kind of guy. Okay. Were they using criteria-based content analysis? In other words, a type of statement analysis for assessing credibility? Were they using behavioral analysis questions? Those behavioral analysis questions where you ask a series of set questions, and depending on how the person answers one way or the other, could you determine guilt or deception based on those responses? They also determined whether the interviewer using rationalization, were they projecting, were they minimizing, were they blaming the victim, and so forth. They looked at, did the interviewer have a set or static type of formula? Something along the line of maybe a cookbook, if you will. Follow these magic steps, it must go in this sequence, and that's when you're going to get success. So it's kind of like a Martha Stewart or Betty Crocker cookbook type of approach. They looked at the interviewers who were very adaptive, and did they adjust, first of all, to the subject's cognitive and emotional changes? So as the subject was changing, were they changing? Okay. Then was the assumption that all, for example, burglars interviewed this way, all sex crimes interviewed like that, all robberies interviewed this way, all auto theft another, all white-collar crimes. So was there a static approach to the type of crime that was being interviewed? Because each of these cases, they looked at different types of criminal activity. So what was fitting the most? They looked at, did the interviewer treat every subject exactly the same, as if there was no unique characteristic or no unique background to that individual? Or did they adjust to the uniqueness of the subject? So they cataloged all those. So interview number 1, the guy used these tactics. Interview number 2, and so forth, all the way through 600. Then they went back, said, okay, which one of these tactics was the most successful? What was interesting, there wasn't a single tactic. So let's get out of the there's only one single tactic if you're going to learn one thing, that's the thing you got to do. That didn't show up. So they started looking at combinations. They look at the end to see when the interview was successful, least contaminated subjects, non-coercive, etc. And they went back and looked at what the interviewer did. And they discovered, surprisingly, that there's 3 tactics that hit the highest on getting the best results. Now, as a comparison, you may know that I think we've talked before, if we've been in class together, and you need to get down and sit down and into at least a 3-day, if not a 5-day block with me, so I can really go into this in detail. So I'll have to explain this briefly. In Western democracies, we have a rough estimate of what the average admission to confession rate is. It's about 38%, which, when you think about it, it's not really that good overall. And you notice I got to put Western democracies in there, okay, for a reason. When these 3 tactics were put into play, there was a phenomenal success rate. Those 3 tactics: number 1, it was a narrative-based interview. What I've been telling you for quite some time, it was a narrative-oriented interview. What I've been talking about for 35 years as being the most successful type of approach. They found the narrative got more information, least contamination, maintained cooperation and compliance with the subject, was non-coercive in nature, and was always substantiated at the end, and it was easier, and the interviewer was more successful at spotting deception using that. Second thing they found was the interviewer who adjusted to the subject's cognitive and emotional changes, or we talk about were they reacting or responding. So the interviewer recognized that verbally and non-verbally, this subject is in reaction behavior, so it's going to be non-productive, and they would change their approach to get the subject into a response behavior where they're compliant and move the interview forward. The third piece of the puzzle is when they understood the unique characteristics, the unique behavior type of the subject they were interviewing. So for example, you might have, let's say you got 5 armed robberies and you get 5 different guys. Theoretically, you might have 3 or 4 different tactics you would use based on that individual type. Or let's say, for example, you have 3 subjects who commit the robbery together. They did it as a team, right? You would wind up interviewing each of those personalities differently because on their behavior type, because they had different reasoning processes and different mechanisms. Now here's the cool part. When those 3 tactics were done, narrative-based interview, adjusted the reaction-response behaviors, and unique behavior type of the subject, success rate was 87%. So let's take a look at our takeaways now from what we picked up from this research and what tactics, if I'm going to study and master any 3 specific things or specific tools are going to be the most effective, what would they be? Number 1, are you conducting a narrative interview? We'll talk some more about that, and I've alluded to it in every single one of our previous tips that we've been working on, interview and interrogation. So it's a narrative-based format. Its philosophy is information gathering. More information, 60% in fact, and a higher rate of spotting deception. Second, will you be adjusting to the subject's cognitive and emotional changes? When you recognize it's a reaction versus response, are you on the fly seeing those changes by listening and watching to nonverbal behavior, listening to the verbal cues and nonverbal output, so I can establish this guy's in reaction or she's in a response state, and so I can move forward. If the reaction, I change something and I change my approach adaptively to that subject. And third, you've got to recognize the uniqueness to each individual, their total history, their personality, their background, their motivators. And remember, subjects always do what's best for them in their mind, not based on what the interviewer is doing. So the 3 tools that you would affect: narrative-based, adjusting the cognitive emotional changes, and adjusting the subject's behavior personality type. So that's tip number 38. Again, if you will, please, if you will hit the like button down below, it pushes up into the higher rankings of the search engines. And if you will, pass this along. Grab the share link down there, drop this in an email, or forward this link, the first email that you got from me as a subscriber, forward it on to somebody else. And I want to really boost and reach out to a lot more folks. And I've got a couple of new projects coming that you'll pick up on soon, and I'll need to have that on that list to make sure that you're getting that information. So be sure you subscribe here. Hit the subscribe button for YouTube. Over on my website, first of all, pick up that new ebook that I've got available for you and the new pocket guide. There's 2 links there for you to get that. I'm trying to get these resources into your hands, and look for something new that's coming I think you really would like. So great to be with you again. Please be safe. Come back with us for another Interviewing and Interrogation tip number 39. See you again soon.